Table of Contents. Title page. Introduction. 1. Reclaiming Your Health. The Origins of Deep Nutrition. 2. The Intelligent Gene. Epigenetics and the Language of DNA. 3. Dynamic Symmetry. Nature's Desire for Beauty. 4. The Greatest Gift. The Creation and Preservation of Genetic Wealth. 5. A Mother's Wisdom. Letting your body create a perfect baby. 6. The Great Nutrition Migration. From the Culinary Garden of Eden to Outer Space. 7. The 4 Pillars of World Cuisine. Foods that program your body for beauty, brains, and health. 8. Good fats and bad. How the cholesterol theory created a sickness epidemic. 9. Sickly sweet. How carbohydrate-rich diets block metabolic function. 10. Beyond calories. Using food as a language to achieve ideal body weight. 11. Forever young. Collagen health and lifespan. 12. Epilogue. Health without healthcare. Appendices. Tests to measure your health. Steps for including the 4 pillars in your diet. Our 4-pillar menu. Selected recipes. Shopping, reading, and resources. References 307. Introduction. This book describes the diet to end all diets. That's easy to say, of course. All kinds of nutrition books claim to describe the one and only, best of all diet, the last one you'll ever need. The truth is, there really are a lot of good diets out there. You're already familiar with some of them, the Okinawan, the Mediterranean, and the French, who paradoxically live long, healthy lives though their foods are so heavy and rich. As a physician, I've often wondered, as have many of my patients had, it is, exactly, that makes all these good diets so special. If the people in Japan, eating lots of fish and fresh vegetables, and the people of the Mediterranean, eating dairy and foods drenched in olive oil, can enjoy superior health, and attribute their good health to the foods they eat, then how is it that enjoying apparently different foods they can both lay claim to the number 1, best diet on earth? Could it be that many cultures hold equal claim to a fantastically successful nutritional program? Might it be that people all over the world are doing things right, acquiring the nutrients their bodies need to stay healthy and feel young by eating what appear to be different foods but which are, in reality, nutritionally equivalent? This book comprehensively describes what could be called the human diet. It is the first to identify and describe the commonalities between all the most successful nutritional programs people the world over have depended on for millennia to protect their health and encourage the birth of healthy children so that the heritage of optimum health can be gifted to the next generation, and the generations that follow. We like to talk about leaving a sustainable, healthy environment for our children. The latest science fuses the environmental discussion with the genetic one. When we talk environmental sustainability, we are necessarily talking about our genomic sustainability. This is also the first book to discuss health across generations. Because of a new science called epigenetics, it will no longer make sense to consider our health purely on the personal level. When we think of our health, we think of our own bodies, as in I feel good, I like my weight, I'm doing fine. Epigenetics is teaching us that our genes can be healthy or sick, just like we can. And if our genes are healthy when we have children, that health is imparted to them. If our genes are ailing, then that illness can be inherited as well. Because epigenetics allows us to consider health in the context of a longer timeline, we are now able to understand how what we eat as parents can change everything about our children, even the way they look. We'll talk about how, with the right foods, we can get our genome into shape to give our kids a fighting chance. One of the most important new concepts of deep nutrition is this idea that the foods parents eat can change the way their children look. Actually, it's not entirely new. Most of us are familiar with fetal alcohol syndrome, a developmental impairment characterized by a set of facial abnormalities caused by alcohol consumption during pregnancy. Those very same developmental impairments can be caused by malnutrition. I see this every day in my clinic. you'll learn why following the standard dietary recommendations currently promoted by nutritionists and dietitians means running the risk that your child's development will be similarly affected. Only thing I call second sibling syndrome. There's been a reluctance to equate good looks with good health then, for that matter, to broach the subject. But with the healthcare infrastructure creaking under the bloat of chronically ill children and adults, it's time to get real. We're not talking about abstract aesthetic concepts of beauty. If you're planning on having a child, and you want them to have every opportunity in life, you want them to be physically attractive. How do we know what's attractive? We met with the world's leading expert in the science of beauty to find out for ourselves what exactly makes a person pretty or plain. His name is Dr. Stephen Marquardt. He's a highly sought-after plastic surgeon living outside LA, and his Marquardt mask shows how the perfect human face is the inevitable result of a person's body growing in accordance with the mathematical rules of nature. You're going to meet another maverick, a man who should be considered the father of modern nutrition. Like Marquardt, the plastic surgeon, this modest dentist refused to accept the idea that it was natural for children's teeth to crowd and shift as haphazardly as tombstones on frost-heaved ground. Teeth should fit, he insisted. He traveled the world to determine if remaining on traditional foods would ensure the proper growth of children so that their teeth, their eyes, and every organ in their body would match one another in perfect proportion, ensuring optimum function and extraordinary health. He discovered that human health depends on traditional foods. Epigenetics proves that this is so because our genes expect the nutrients traditional foods provide. When you have finished reading this book, you will have completely revised the way you think about food. We're going to do away with calorie counting and struggling to find the perfect ratio of carbs to protein to fat. These terms aren't useful because they say nothing about what really matters about your food. Food is like a language, an unbroken information stream that connects every cell in your body to an aspect of the natural world. The better the source and the more undamaged the message when it arrives to your cells, the better your health will be. If you eat a properly cooked steak from an open-range, grass-fed cow, then you are receiving information not only about the health of that cow's body, but about the health of the grasses from which it ate, and the soil from which those grasses grew. If you want to know whether or not a steak, or a fish, or a carrot is good for you, ask yourself what portions of the natural world it represents, and whether or not the bulk of that information remains intact. This requires traveling backwards down the food chain, step by step, until you reach the ground or the sea. In the following chapters, you will learn that the secret to healthy big secret, the one no one's talking about is that there is no secret. Getting healthy, really healthy, and staying healthy can be easy. Avoiding cancer and dependence on medications, staving off heart disease, keeping a razor-sharp mind well into advanced years, and even having healthy, beautiful children are all aspects of the human experience that can be, and should be, under your control. You can live better, and it doesn't have to be that difficult. You just have to be armed with the right information. No matter what you already believe about diet, medicine, or health, including the limits of your own healthy book you're about to read will enable you to make better sense of what you already know. To answer what is for many people a nagging question, who's right? What's the simple, complete picture that ties all the best information together, so that I can know, once and for all, which foods my family is supposed to eat and which ones we need to avoid? How can I be sure that what I am preparing for my children will give them a better chance to grow normally, succeed in school, and live long, happy lives? What am I supposed to make for dinner? This book will give you the answer. 1. Reclaiming your health. The origins of deep nutrition. Ask 10 people what the healthiest diet in the world is and you'll get 10 different answers. Some people swear by the Okinawa diet. Others like the Mediterranean or the French. But have you ever thought to wonder what it is about all these traditional diets that makes the people eating them so healthy? This book will describe the common rules that link all successful diets. We call them the 4 pillars of world cuisine. Throughout history, people have used them to protect their own health, and grow healthy, beautiful children. In other words, they used diet to engineer their bodies. Most of us probably have something we'd want to change about the way we look, or about our health. What if you could use food to change your body at the genetic level? Think about it, what if you could re-engineer your genes to your liking? Want to be like Mike? How about Tiger Woods? Halle Berry? George Clooney? Or maybe you want to change your genes so that you can still be you, only better. Just a modest upgrade: sexier body, better health, greater athleticism, and a better attitude. When you start to consider what you might be willing to pay for all this, you realize that the greatest gift on earth is a set of healthy genes. The lucky few who do inherit pristinely healthy genes are recognized as genetic lottery winners and spend their lives enjoying the many benefits of beauty, brains, and brawn. Being a genetic marvel doesn't mean you automatically get everything you want, but if you have the genes and the desire, you can have the world at your feet. Back in the mid-1980s, a handful of biotech millionaires thought they had the technology to bring daydreams like these to life. They organized the Human Genome Project, which, we were told, was going to revolutionize how medicine was practiced and how babies were conceived and born. At the time, conventional medical wisdom held that some of us turn out beautiful and talented while others don't because, at some point, Mother Nature made a mistake or two while reproducing DNA. These mistakes lead to random mutations and, obviously, you can't be a genetic marvel if your genes are scabbied with mutations. The biotech whiz kids got the idea that if they could get into our genes and fix the mutations with genetic vaccines or patches, they could effectively rig the lottery. On June 26, 2000, they reached the first milestone in this ambitious scheme and announced they'd cracked the code. This is the outstanding achievement not only of our lifetime but in terms of human history, Dr. Michael Dexter, the project's administrator, declared. Many were counting on new technologies such as this to magically address disease at its source. Investors and geneticists promised the mutations responsible for hypertension, depression, cancer, male pattern baldness, potentially whatever we wanted would soon be neutralized and corrected. In the weeks that followed, I listened to scientists on talk shows stirring up publicity by claiming the next big thing would be made-to-order babies, fashioned using so-called designer genes. But I was skeptical. Actually, more than skeptical, knew it to be hype. I knew this because a decade earlier, in 1989, while at Cornell University, I learned from leaders in the field that a layer of biologic complexity existed which would undermine such bullish predictions. It was an inconvenient reality these scientists kept tucked under their hats. While the project's supporters described our chromosomes as static chunks of information that could be easily and safely manipulated, a new field of science, called epigenetics, had already proved this fundamental assumption wrong. Epigenetics helps us understand that the genome is more like a dynamic, living being growing, learning, and adapting constantly. You may have heard that most disease is due to random mutations, or bad genes. But epigenetics tells us otherwise. If you need glasses or get cancer or age faster than you should, you very well may have perfectly normal genes. What's gone wrong is how they function, what scientists call genetic expression. Just as we can get sick when we don't take care of ourselves, it turns out, so can our genes. Your diet changes how your genes work. In the old model of genetic medicine, diseases arise from permanent damage to DNA, called mutations, portions of the genetic code where crucial data has been distorted by a biological typo. Mutations were thought to arise from mistakes DNA makes while generating copies of itself, and therefore, the health of your genes and Darwinian evolution was dependent on random rolling of the dice. Mutations were, for many decades, presumed to be the root cause of everything from knock-knees to short stature to high blood pressure and depression. This model of inheritance is the reason doctors tell people with family histories of cancer, diabetes, and so on that they've inherited genetic time bombs ready to go off at any moment. It's also the reason we call the genetic lottery a lottery. The underlying principle is that we have little or no control. But epigenetics has identified a ghost in the machine, giving us a different vision of Mother Nature's most fantastic molecule. Epigenetic translates to upon the gene. Epigenetic researchers study how our own genes react to our behavior, and they've found that just about everything we eat, think, breathe, or do can, directly or indirectly, trickle down to touch the gene and affect its performance in some way. These effects are carried forward into the next generation where they can be magnified. In laboratory experiments, researchers have shown that, simply by feeding mice with different blends of vitamins, they can change the next generation's adult weight and susceptibility to disease, and these new developments can then be passed on again, to grandchildren too. It's looking as though we've grossly underestimated the dictum "you are what you eat." Not only does what we eat affect us down to the level of our genes, our physiques have been sculpted, in part, by the foods our parents and grandparents ate or didn't eat generations ago. The body of evidence compiled by thousands of epigenetic researchers working all over the world suggests that the majority of people's medical problems do not come from mutations, as previously thought, but rather from harmful environmental factors that force good genes to behave badly, by switching them on and off at the wrong time. And so, genes that were once healthy can, at any point in our lives, start acting sick. The environmental factors controlling how well our genes are working will vary from minute to minute, and each one of your cells reacts differently. So you can imagine how complex the system is. It's this complexity which makes it impossible to predict whether a given smoker will develop lung cancer, colon cancer, or no cancer at all. The epigenetic modulation is so elaborate and so dynamic that it's unlikely we'll ever develop a technologic fix for most of what ails us. So far, it may sound like epigenetics is all bad news. But ultimately, epigenetics is showing us that the genetic lottery is anything but random. Though some details may forever elude science, the bottom line is clear: we control the health of our genes. The concept of gene health is simple. Genes work fine until disturbed. External forces that disturb the normal ebb and flow of genetic function can be broken into two broad categories: toxins and nutrient imbalances. Toxins are harmful compounds we may eat, drink, or breathe into our bodies, or even manufacture internally when we experience undue stress. Nutrient imbalances are usually due to deficiencies, missing vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, or other raw materials required to run our cells. You may not have control over the quality of the air you breathe or be able to quit your job in order to reduce stress. But you do have control over what may be the most powerful class of gene-regulating factors: food. A holistic perspective of food. Believe it or not, designer babies aren't a new idea. People designed babies in ancient times. No, they didn't aim for a particular eye or hair color. Their goal was more practical: give birth to healthy, bright, and happy babies. Their tools were not high technology in the typical sense of the word, of course. Their tool was biology, combined with their own common sense, wisdom, and careful observation. Reproduction was not entered into casually, as it too often is today, because the production of healthy babies was necessary to the community's long-term survival. Through trial and error, people learned that, when certain foods were missing from a couple's diet, their children came out with problems. They learned which foods helped to ease delivery, which encouraged the production of calmer, more intelligent children who grew rapidly and rarely fell sick, and then passed this information on. Without this nurturing wisdom, we as we are presently defined never would have made it this far. Widely scattered evidence indicates that all successful cultures accumulated vast collections of nutritional guidelines anthologized over the course of many generations and placed into a growing body of wisdom. This library of knowledge was not a tertiary aspect of these cultures. It was ensconced safely within the vaults of religious doctrine and ceremony to ensure its unending revival. The following excerpt offers one example of what the locals living in Yukon Territory in Canada knew about scurvy, a disease of vitamin C deficiency, which at the time in 1930, still killed European explorers to the region. When I asked an old Indian why he did not tell the white man how to prevent scurvy, his reply was that the white man knew too much to ask the Indian anything. I then asked him if he would tell me. He said he would if the chief said he might. He returned in an hour, saying that the chief said he could tell me because I was a friend of the Indians. He then described how when the Indian kills a moose he opens it up, and at the back of the moose just above the kidney there are what he described as two small balls in the fat, the adrenal glands. These he said the Indian would take and cut up into as many pieces as there were little and big Indians in the family, and each one would eat his piece. 3. When I first encountered this passage, it was immediately obvious just how sophisticated the accumulated knowledge once was or better than my medical school training in nutrition. My textbook said that vitamin C only comes from fruits and vegetables. In the text, the chief makes specific reference to his appreciation of the interviewer's advice to avoid the food in the trading posts, demonstrating how, in indigenous culture, advice regarding food and nutrition is held in high esteem, even treated as a valuable object that can serve as consideration in a formal exchange. We become accustomed to using the word share these days, as in, let me share a story with you. But this was sharing in the truest sense, as in offering a gift of novel weaponry or a fire-starting device tends not to be given up lightly. In fact, the book's author admitted consistent difficulty extracting nutrition-related information for this very reason. There is an old African saying, when an elder dies, a library burns to the ground. And so, unfortunately, this particular human instinct and understandable apprehension of sharing with outsiders has allowed much of what used to be known to die away. Today we are raised to think of food as a kind of enriched fuel, a source of calories and a carrier for vitamins, which help prevent disease. In contrast, ancient peoples understood food to be a holy thing, and eating was a sanctified act. Their songs and prayers reflected the belief that, in consuming food, each of us comes in contact with the great, interconnected web of life. Epigenetics proves that intuitive idea to be essentially true. Our genes make their day-to-day decisions based on chemical information they receive from the food we eat, information encoded in our food and carried from that food item's original source, a microenvironment of land or sea. In that sense, food is less like a fuel and more like a language conveying information from the outside world. That information programs your genes, for better or for worse. Today's genetic lottery winners are those people who inherited well-programmed, healthy genes by virtue of their ancestors' abilities to properly plug into that chemical information stream. If you want to help your genes get healthy, you need to plug into and this is the book that can help. For 10 years, I have studied how food programs genes and how that programming affects physiology. I've learned that food can tame unruly genetic behavior far more reliably than biotechnology. By simply replenishing your body with the nourishment that facilitates optimal gene expression, it's possible to eliminate genetic malfunction and, with it, pretty much all known disease. No matter what kind of genes you were born with, I know that eating right can help reprogram them, immunizing you against cancer, premature aging and dementia, enabling you to control your metabolism, your moods, your weight and much, much more. And if you start planning early enough, and your genetic momentum is strong enough, you can give your children a shot at reaching for the stars. Who am I? In many ways, it was my own unhealthy genes that inspired me to go to medical school and, later, to write this book. I'd had more than my fair share of problems from the beginning of my sports career. In high school track, I suffered with Achilles tendinitis, then calcaneal bursitis, then iliotibial band syndrome, and it seemed to me that I was constantly fitting corrective inserts into my shoes or adding new therapeutic exercises to my routine. In college I developed a whole new crop of soft tissue problems, including a case of shin splints so severe it almost cost me my athletics scholarship. When my shin splints got bad enough that I had to start skipping practice, I paid another visit to the team physician. Dr. Scotty, a stubby, mustached man with thick black hair and a high-pitched voice, told me that this time he couldn't help me. All I could do was cut back my training and wait. But I was sure there was something else I needed to do. Perhaps I had some kind of dietary deficiency? Applying my newly acquired mastery of Biology 101, I suggested that, perhaps, my connective tissue cells couldn't make normal tendons. Like many of my own patients insist today, I pushed Dr. Scotty to get to the bottom of my problem. I even had a plan: simply take some kind of biopsy of the tendon in my leg and compare the material to a healthy tendon. My ideas went nowhere, as I imagine such suggestions often do. Dr. Scotty furrowed his bushy eyebrows and said he'd never heard of any such test. I'd read stories in Newsweek and Time about the powerful diagnostics being brought to us by molecular biology. In my naivety, I couldn't believe Dr. Scotty didn't know how to use any of that science to help me. I was so confounded by the unwillingness to consider what seemed to me to be the obvious course of action, and so enamored with the idea of getting to the molecular root of physical problems and so enthralled by the promise of the whole burgeoning biotech field had I scrapped my plans to be a chemical engineer and enrolled in every course I could to study genetics. I went to graduate school at Cornell, where I learned about gene regulation and epigenetics from Nobel Prize-winning researchers, then straight to Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in New Jersey, in hopes of putting my knowledge of the fundamentals of genetics to practical use. I then found out why Dr. Scotty had been dumbfounded by my questions years before. Medical school doesn't teach doctors to address the root of the problem. It teaches doctors to treat the problem. It's a practical science with practical aims. In this way, medicine differs quite drastically from other natural sciences. Take, for instance, physics, which has built a body of deep knowledge by always digging down to get to the roots of a problem. Physicists have now dug so deep that they are grappling with one of the most fundamental questions of all: how did the universe begin? But medicine is different from other sciences because, more than being a science, it is first and foremost a business. This is why, when people taking a hard pill called Lonitin started growing unwanted hair on their arms, researchers didn't ask why. Instead, they looked for customers. And Lonitin, the hard pill, became Rogaine, the spray for balding men. Medicine is full of examples like this, one the most lucrative being the discovery of sildenafil, originally for blood pressure until found to have the happy side effect of prolonging erections and repackaged into Viagra. Since medicine is a business, medical research must ultimately generate some kind of saleable product. And that is why we still don't know what leads to common problems like shin splints. I didn't go to medical school to become a businesswoman. My dreams had sprouted from a seed planted in my psyche when I was 5, during an incident with a baby robin. Sitting on the street curb in front of my house one spring morning, the plump little fledgling flew down from the maple tree to land on the street in front of me. Looking directly at me, he chirped and flapped his wings as if to say, "Look what I can do." And then I saw the front tire of a station wagon roll up behind him. In a blink, the most adorable creature I'd ever seen was smashed into a feather pancake, a lifeless stain on the asphalt. Dead. I was outraged. Overwhelmed with guilt. Whoever was driving that car had no idea of the trauma he'd just inflicted on 2 young lives. This was my first experience with the finality of death, and it awoke a protective instinct that has driven my career decisions ever since: prevent harm. It was why I'd wanted to be a chemical engineer to invent non-toxic baby diapers and why I had gone to medical school. I was all about prevention, and that meant I needed to understand what makes us tick and what makes us sick. Unfortunately, soon after enrolling in medical school, I found that the gap between my childhood dream and the reality of limited medical knowledge was enormous. So enormous that, I concluded, it wasn't yet possible to breach. To pursue my dream of preventing harm, the best I could do was practice preventive medicine, and the best place to do this was within the specialty of primary care. To tell the truth, I kind of forgot about the whole idea of getting to the bottom of what makes people sick, and for many years after graduation I went on with ordinary life. Until something drew me back in. Respecting our ancient wisdom. It was those malfunctioning genes of mine, again. Shortly after moving to Hawaii, I developed another musculoskeletal problem. But this one was different from all the others. This time no doctor, not even 5 different specialists, could tell me what it was. And it didn't go away. A year after I developed the first unusual stinging pain around my right knee, I could no longer walk more than a few feet without getting feverish. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard of. I'd had exploratory surgery, injections, physical therapy, and I'd even seen a Hawaiian kahuna. But everything I tried seemed to make the problem worse. Just as I was giving up hope, Lou came up with an idea: try studying nutrition. As an excellent chef and an aficionado of all things relating to cuisine, he'd been impressed by the variety and flavors he encountered at the local Filipino buffets. Like many professional chefs I've spoken with since, he suspected there might be other opinions out there on what healthy food might actually be. Having fought his own battles against malnutrition while growing up on the wrong side of the tracks in small-town USA, he recognized that there were nutritional haves and have-nots, as there is with everything else. And he suspected that my high-sugar, convenience food diet put me in the have-not category and might even be impairing my ability to heal. Sure, I thought, everyone has an opinion. I on the other hand went to medical school. Took a course on nutrition. I learned biochemistry. I already knew to eat low fat, low cholesterol and count my calories. What more did I need to know? The next day, Luke brought home a book. Had I not been literally immobilized, I may never have bothered opening Andrew Weil's book Spontaneous Healing and started reading. Medical school teaches us to believe that we're living longer now, and so today's diet must beat the diets of the past, hands down. This argument had me so convinced that I never considered questioning the dietary dogma I'd absorbed throughout my schooling. But realize that today's 80-year-olds grew up on an entirely different, more natural diet. They were also the first generation to benefit from antibiotics, and many have been kept alive thanks only to technology. Today's generation has yet to prove its longevity, but given that many 40-year-olds already have joint and cardiovascular problems that their parents didn't get until much later in life, as is true in my practice, I don't think we can assume they have the same life expectancy. And the millennium generation's lifespan may be 10 to 20 years shorter, for I was going to get my first inkling of this reality very soon. Once I cracked the book open, it didn't take much reading to bump into something I've never heard of before: omega-3 fatty acids. According to Weil, these are fats we need to eat, just like vitamins. These days, our diets are so deficient that we need to supplement. This blew my mind. First of all, I'd thought fats were bad. Secondly, we were supposed to be eating better today than at any point in human history. Either he was off base, or my medical education had failed to provide some basic information. Like a kid who gets into the bathtub kicking and screaming and then doesn't want to get out, I soon couldn't get enough of these alternative books. Inside them wasn't just new information, but hope that I might walk normally again. In another publication, I came across an intriguing article entitled Guts and Grease: The Diet of Native Americans, which suggested that Native Americans were healthier than their European counterparts because they ate the entire animal. Not just muscle, but all the guts and grease. According to John Fire Lame Deer, the eating of guts had evolved into a contest. In the old days we used to eat the guts of the buffalo, making a contest of it, two fellows getting hold of a long piece of intestines from opposite ends, starting chewing toward the middle, seeing who can get there first. That's eating. Those buffalo guts, full of half-fermented, half-digested grass and herbs, you didn't need any pills and vitamins when you swallowed those 5. I liked the voice of authority this Native American assumed, as if he were drawing from a secret well of knowledge. I also liked that the article's authors offered healthy people as evidence instead of statistics of lab simulations. At the time, the approach struck me as novel, focusing on health rather than disease. Early European explorers Cabeza de Vaca, Francisco Vacques de Coronado, and Lewis and Clark described Native Americans as superhuman warriors, able to run down buffalo on foot and, in battle, continue fighting after being shot through with an arrow. Photographs taken 200 years later, in the 1800s, capture the Native Americans' imposing visage and broad, balanced bone structure. Presenting a people's stamina and strength as evidence of a healthy diet seemed reasonable, and it rang true with my own clinical experience in Hawaii. The healthiest family members are, in many cases, the oldest, raised on foods vastly different from those being fed to their great-grandchildren. I begin to doubt my presumption that today's definition of a healthy diet was nutritionally superior to diets of years past. Still, the dietary program of Native Americans seemed bizarre. Reading the passage about 2 grown men chewing their way through an animal's unwashed, fat-encased intestine forever changed the way I remember the spaghetti scene from Lady and the Tramp. It also brought up some serious questions. For one thing, wouldn't eating buffalo poo make the man ill? And isn't animal fat supposed to be unhealthy? The first issue, eating unwashed intestine, is too much for me to tackle, though later I would. So I sunk my teeth into the matter of the health effects of animal fat. Two things I learned about nutrition in medical school were the saturated fat raises cholesterol levels, and cholesterol is a known killer. Who was right, the American Medical Association, or John Fired Lame Deer? This was how I began to close the knowledge gap that, years ago, had derailed me from pursuing further studies of the fundamentals of disease. To determine the best dietary stance, I would look at all the necessary basic science data on free radicals, fatty acid oxidation, eicosanoid signaling, gene regulation, and the famous Framingham studies, which, fortunately, I had the training to decipher. It took 6 months of research to get to the bottom of this one nutritional question, but I ultimately came to understand that the nutrition science I'd learned in medical school was full of contradictions, and resting on assumptions proved false by researchers in other, related scientific fields. The available evidence failed to support the AMA's position, and overwhelmingly sided with that of John Fired Lame Deer. This was a big deal. Contrary to the opinion of medical leaders today, saturated fat and cholesterol appeared to be beneficial nutrients. Chapter 8 explains how heart disease really develops. 50 years of removing foods containing these nutrients from our diets, foods like eggs, fresh cream, and liver, or replace them with low-fat or outright artificial chemicals like trans-rich margarine, have starved our genes of the chemical information on which they've come to depend. Simply by cutting eggs and sausage originally made with lactic acid starter culture instead of nitrates, and containing chunks of white cartilage from our breakfasts to replace them with cold cereals, would mean that generations of children have been fed fewer fats, B vitamins, and collagenous proteins than required for optimal growth. Here's why. The yolk of an egg is full of brain-building fats, including lecithin, phospholipids, and, only if from free-range chickens, essential fatty acids and vitamins A and D. Meanwhile, low-fat diets have been shown to reduce intelligence in animals. 6 B vitamins play key roles in the development of every organ system, and women with vitamin B deficiencies give birth to children prone to developing weak bones, diabetes, and more. 7, 8 chunks of cartilage supply us with collagen and glycosaminoglycans, factors that help facilitate the growth of robust connective tissues, which would help to prevent later life tendon and ligament problems including shin splints. 9. By righting the wrong assumptions that mushroom from this one piece of nutritional misinformation, I had already gained a greater understanding of the root causes of disease than I'd thought possible, at least since attending medical school. A single item of medical misinformation, that cholesterol-rich foods are dangerous, had drastically changed our eating habits and with that our access to nutrients. The effect on my personal physiology was to weaken my connective tissues, an epigenetic response that had already managed to change the course of my life in ways that I can't begin to calculate. After reading every old-fashioned cookbook I could get my hands on, and enough biochemistry to understand the essential character of traditional cuisine, I changed everything about the way I eat. For me, eating in closer accordance with historical human nutrition corrected some of my damaged epigenetic programming. I got fewer colds, less heartburn, improved my moods, lost my belly fat, had fewer headaches, and increased my mental energy. And eventually my swollen knee got better. What our ancestors knew that your doctor doesn't. It seems like every day another study comes out showing the benefits of some vitamin or mineral or antioxidant supplement in the prevention of a given disease. All these studies taken together send a strong message that doctors still underestimate the power of nutrition to fortify and to heal. Of course, people know this intuitively, which is why dietary supplements and nutraceuticals sell so well. Unfortunately, in all this research there is also something that's not talked about very often. Artificial vitamins and powdered, encapsulated antioxidant products are not as effective as the real thing, not even close. They can even be harmful. A far better option is to eat more nutritious food. To identify the most nutritious food, Luke and I have studied traditions from all over the world. The goal was not to identify the best tradition, but to understand what all traditions have in common. we identified 4 universal elements, each of which represent a distinct set of ingredients along with the cooking or other preparation technique that maximize the nutrition delivered to our cells. For the bulk of human history, these techniques and materials have proved indispensable. The reason that so many of us have health problems today is that we no longer eat in accordance with any culinary tradition. In the worst cases of recurring illnesses and chronic diseases that I see, more often than not, the victims' parents and grandparents haven't either. This means that most Americans are carrying around very sick genes. But by returning to the same 4 categories of nourishing foods our ancestors' 84 pillars or personal genetic health will be regained. Genetic health and wealth. The health of your genes represents a kind of inheritance. 2 ways of thinking about this inheritance, genetic wealth and genetic momentum, help explain why some people can abuse this inheritance and, for a time, get away with it. Just as a lazy student born into a prominent family can be assured he'll get into Yale no matter his grades, healthy genes don't have to be attended to very diligently in order for their owners' bodies to look beautiful. The next generation, however, will pay the price. We've all seen the 20-year-old supermodel who abuses her body with cigarettes and Twinkies. For years, her beautiful skeletal architecture will still shine though. Beneath the surface, poor nutrition will deprive those bones of what they need, thinning them prematurely. The connective tissues supporting her skin will begin to break down, stealing away her beauty. Most importantly, deep inside her ovaries, inside each egg, her genes will be affected. Those deleterious genetic alterations mean that her child will have lost genetic momentum and will not have the same potential for health or beauty as she did. He or she may benefit from mom's sizable financial portfolio while Daniel and Nicole Smith Jr.'s genetic wealth will, unfortunately, have been drawn down. That's a real loss. Over the millennia, our genes developed under the influence of a steady stream of nourishing foods gleaned from the most nutritionally potent corners of the natural world. Today's supermodels have benefited not just from their parents' and grandparents' healthy eating habits, but from hundreds, even thousands, of generations of ancestors who, by eating the right foods, maintained and even improved upon a genetic heirloom that would ultimately construct a beautiful face in the womb. All of this accumulated wealth can be disposed of as easily and as mindlessly as the 20-year-old supermodel would flick away a cigarette. Such squandering of genetic wealth measure of the intactness of epigenetic programming has affected many of us. My own father grew up drinking powdered milk and ate margarine on Wonder Bread every day at lunch. My mother spent much of her childhood in post-war Europe, where dairy products were scarce. Because they had inherited genetic wealth from their parents, my parents never had significant soft tissue problems in spite of these shortcomings. But those suboptimal diets did take a toll on their genes. Much of the genetic wealth of my family line had been squandered by the time I was born. Unlike my parents and grandparents, I had to struggle to keep my joints from falling apart. Fortunately for me, my story is not over and neither is yours. Thanks to the plasticity of genetic response, we can all improve the health of our genes and rebuild our genetic wealth. Anyone who has chronically neglected a plant and watched its leaves curl and its color fade knows that proper care and feeding can have dramatic, restorative effects. The same applies to our genes and our epigenetic programming. Not only will you personally benefit from this during your lifetime with improved health, normalization of fat distribution, remission of chronic disease, and resistance to the effects of age, your children will benefit as well. If you think saving money for college or moving to a neighborhood with a good school system is important, then consider the importance of ensuring that your children are as healthy and beautiful as they can be. If you start early enough, the fruits of your efforts will be clearly visible in the bones of your child's face, the face they may one day be presenting to the one person who can give them the opportunity for all the other candidates to inaugurate the career of their dreams. It all depends on you, how you eat and how you choose to live. I am not a specialist in stress reduction, though stress reduction is vital, and I won't be talking that much about exercise other than to describe how different types of exercise will help you lose weight and build healthy tissue. However, by virtue of my training and subsequent studies, I am an expert at predicting the physiologic effects of eating different types of food. And my basic philosophy is simple. Deep nutrition. I subscribe to the school of nutritional thought that counsels us to eat the same foods people ate in the past because, after all, that's how we got here. It's how we're designed to eat. Epigenetics supplies the scientific support for the idea by giving molecular evidence that we are who we are, in large part, because of the foods our ancestors ate. But because healthy genes, like healthy people, can perform well under difficult conditions for a finite amount of time, there is, in effect, a delay in the system. Since nutritional researchers don't ask study participants what their parents ate, the conclusions drawn from those studies are based on incomplete data. A poor diet can seem healthy if studied for a 24-hour period. A slightly better diet can seem successful for months or even years. Only the most complete diets, however, can provide health generation after generation. Diet books that adopt this long-term philosophy, such as Paleo Diet, Evolution Diet, and Health Secrets of the Stone Age, have been incredibly successful partly by virtue of the philosophy itself, which has intuitive appeal. Fleshing out the bare bones of the nutritional philosophy with specifics, real ingredients, and real recipes, is another matter. Authors of previously published books are still working on the old random mutation model, and so, they don't realize how fast genetic change can occur. In going all the way back to the prehistoric era, they take the idea too far to be practical. Their evidence is so limited it's literally skeletal leaned from campfire debris, chips of bone, and the cleanings of mummified stomachs. These books do give us fascinating glimpses of life in the distant past. And I'm impressed by how the authors use modern physiologic science to expand tiny tidbits of data into a complete dietary regime. But each of these books, often citing the same information, leaves us with contradicting advice. Why? The data they have is simply too fragmented, too old, and too short on detail to give us meaningful guidance. How can we reproduce the flavors and nutrients found in our Paleolithic predecessors' dinners when the only instructions they left behind come in the form of such artifacts as the 125,000-year-old spear crafted from a yew tree found embedded between the ribs of an extinct straight-tusked elephant in Germany, and cut marks that have been found on the bones of fossilized animals? 10. The authors do their best to make educated guesses, but clearly, a creative mind could follow this ancient trail of evidence to end up wherever they like. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on prehistory or educated guesses. There is a much richer, living source of information available to us. It's called Cuisine. Specifically, authentic cuisine. By authentic, I'm not talking about the Americanized salad and seafood translation of Mediterranean or Okinawan or Chinese diets. I'm not talking about modern molecular gastronomy or functional food or fast food. The authentic cuisine I'm referring to is what fondest memories are made of. It's the combination of ingredients and skills that enable families in even the poorest farming communities around the world to create fantastic meals, meals that would be fit for a king and that would satisfy even the snarkiest of New Yorkers than, say, a food connoisseur whose glance has been known to weaken many a top chef contender's knees. I am of course referring to former punk rock chef turned world-trotting celebrity, Anthony Bourdain. As evidence that there's plenty of detailed information surviving to inform us exactly how people used to eat and still should, I submit Bourdain's travel TV show No Reservations. If you haven't seen it already, it's your chance to have the colorful, vastly inventive, and diverse world of culinary art served to you for an hour each week in your living room. Bourdain gets right to the heart of his host country's distinct food culture, beginning each show by casting a historical light on the local food. Guided by food-wise natives, either a busty former Miss Russia or a perpetually sweaty sometime chef named Zamir, he ends up at the right spots to sample food that captures each geographical region's soul. More often than not, these spots end up being the mom-and-pop holes in the wall where people cook the way food has been cooked in that country for as long as anyone can remember. Shows like Bourdain's have helped to convince me that growing up in America is growing up culinarily speaking in an underdeveloped country. While Americans have hot dogs and apple pie, Happy Meals, meatloaf, casseroles, and variations on the theme of salad, citizens of other countries seem to have so much more. In one region of China, a visitor could experience pit-roasted boar, rooster, or rabbit, with a side of any number of different kind of pickle or fermented beans, handcrafted noodles, or fruiting vegetation of every shape, color, size, and texture. In burgeoning, ultra-modern cities, at the base of towering glass buildings around the world, farmers' markets still sell the quality, local ingredients pulled from the earth or fished from the rivers and lakes that morning. My point is not to suggest that America isn't a wonderful country with our own rich history of cuisine. My point is that we're out of touch with our roots. That disconnection is the biggest reason why we have bookshelves full of conflicting nutritional advice. It's also why, though many of us still have good genes, we have not maintained them very well. Like plump grapes left to bake on a French hillside, American chromosomes are wilting on the vine. They can be revitalized simply by enjoying the delightful products of traditional cuisine. The messy amalgamation of vastly different dishes comprising every authentic cuisine can be cleaved into 4 neat categories, which I call the 4 pillars of authentic cuisine. We need to eat them as often as we can, preferably daily. They are as follows: I. Meat cooked on the bone. I. Organs and offal, what Bourdain calls the nasty bits. I. Fresh raw plant and animal products. And IV, better than fresh fermented and sprouted. These categories have proved to be essential by virtue of their ubiquitousness. In almost every country other than ours, people eat them every day. They've proved to be successful by virtue of their practitioners' health and survival. Like cream rising in a glass, these traditions have percolated upwards from the past, buoyed by their intrinsic value. They have endured the test of time simply by being delicious and nutritious, and in celebrating them we can reconnect with our roots and with each other, and bring our lives towards their full potential. Tending the sacred flame. Not too long ago, and without understanding genetics, stem cell biology, or biochemistry, cultures everywhere survive based on living in accordance with the cause and effect realities of their daily experience. Their successes are now memorialized in our existence and in the healthy genetic material we have managed to retain. Solutions to the all-important omnivore's dilemma, he question of what we should be eating all around us, encapsulated in traditions still practiced by foodies, culinary artists, devoted grandmothers, and chefs throughout the world, some in your very own neighborhood. Unfortunately, this wisdom has gone unappreciated, thanks to the cholesterol theory of heart disease and other byproducts of what Michael Pollan calls scientific reductionism, a decidedly unscientific exercise, as Pollan explains in his recent book In Defense of Food. 11 Fortunately, those who love food cooking and good food have kept culinary traditions alive. In doing so, not only have their own families benefited, they also serve as the modern emissaries of our distant relatives, carriers of an ancient secret once intended to be shared only with members of the tribe. Today, we are that tribe. And that message to use food to stay healthy and beautiful is the most precious gift we could possibly receive. Throughout the book we are going to be highlighting the power of food to shape your daily life. In fact, every bite you eat changes your genes a little bit. Just as a genetic lottery follows a set of predictable rules, so do the small changes that occur after every meal. If the machinery of physiologic change is not random, and is instead guided by rules, then who or what keeps track of them? In the next chapter, we'll see how the gene responds to nourishment with what can best be described as intelligence, and why this built-in ability makes me certain that many of us have untapped genetic potential waiting to be released. 2. The intelligent gene. Epigenetics and the language of DNA. I remember getting caught up in the nostalgia when Halle Berry took the stage at the 2002 Oscars, how she stood before the audience and tearfully thanked God for her blessings. Thank you. I'm so honored. I'm so honored. And I thank the Academy for choosing me to be the vessel for which His blessing might flow. Thank you. A laudable Hollywood milestone. She had become the first woman of African American descent to be awarded the Oscar for a leading role. While so much focus was placed on what made this actor, and that evening, unique in the history of Hollywood movies, I couldn't avoid the nagging feeling that there was something familiar about the woman in the stunning Elisa gown, something about her face that reminded me of every other woman who had, over the years, clutched the little golden statue in her hands. what was the link between Ms. Berry and all her Academy-honored sisters like Charlize Theron, Nicole Kidman, Kate Blanchett, Angelina Jolie, Julia Roberts, Kim Basinger, Jessica Lange, Elizabeth Taylor, Ingrid Bergman, and the rest? Yes, they are all talented masters of their craft. But there was something else about them, something more obvious, maybe so obvious that it was one of those things you just learn to take for granted. Then it occurred to me, they are all breathtakingly gorgeous. Like Halle Berry, we are all vessels not necessarily designed to win Oscars, to eat, survive, and reproduce genetic material. So if you happen to win an Oscar, you could make history by extending one last note of gratitude to your extraordinary DNA. When your PR agent chastises you the next morning, just explain to her that we are all active participants in one of the oldest and most profound relationships on our planet between our bodies, our DNA, and the food that connects both to the outside world. Halle Berry's perfectly proportioned, fit, healthy body is evidence of a happy relationship between her genes and the natural environment, one that has remained so for several generations. As this chapter will explain, if you hope to create a more fruitful relationship with your own genes, to get healthier and improve the way you look, you need to learn to work with the intelligence within your DNA. DNA's giant brain. Every cell of your body contains a nucleus, floating within the cytoplasm like the yolk inside an egg. The nucleus holds your chromosomes, 46 supercoiled molecules, and each one of those contains up to 300 million pairs of genetic letters, called nucleic acids. These colorless, gelatinous chemicals visible to the naked eye only when billions of copies are reproduced artificially in the lab constitute the genetic materials that make you who you are. If you stretched out the DNA in one of your cells, its 2.8 billion base pairs would end up totaling 2 to 3 meters long. The DNA from all your cells strung end to end would reach to the moon and back at least 5,000 times 12. That's a lot of chemical information. But your genes take up only 2% of it. The rest of the sequence, the other 98%, is what scientists used to call junk. Not that they thought this remaining DNA was useless. They just didn't know what any of it was for. In the last 2 decades, scientists have discovered this material has some amazing abilities. Epigenetic researchers exploring this expansive genetic territory are finding a hidden world of ornate complexity. Unlike genes, which function as a relatively static repository of encoded data, the so-called junk DNA seems designed for change, both over the short term if in our lifetimes and over periods of several generations, and longer. It appears that junk DNA assists biology in making key decisions, like turning one stem cell into part of an eye, and another stem cell with identical DNA into, say, part of your liver. These decisions seem to be made based on environmental influences. We know this because when you take a stem cell and place it into an animal's liver, it becomes a liver cell. If you took that same stem cell and placed it into an animal's brain, it would become a nerve cell. 13 Junk DNA does all this by using the chemical information floating around it to determine which genes should get turned on when, and in what quantity. One of the most fascinating, and unexpected, lessons of the Human Genome Project is the discovery that our genes are very similar to mouse genes, which are very much like other mammalian genes, which in turn are surprisingly similar to fish. It appears that the proteins humans produce are not particularly unique in the animal kingdom. What makes us uniquely human are the regulatory segments of our genetic material, the same regulatory segments that direct stem cell development during in utero growth and throughout the rest of our lives. Could it be that the same mechanisms facilitating cell maturation also function over generations, enabling species to evolve? According to Arturas Petronis, head of the Crumbill Family Epigenetics Laboratory at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, we really need some radical revision of key principles of the traditional genetic research program. Another epigeneticist puts our misapprehension of evolution in perspective. Mutation and selection-driven evolutionary change is just the tip of the iceberg. The bottom of the iceberg is epigenetics. 14. The more we study this mysterious 98%, the more we find it seems to function as a massively complicated regulatory system which serves to control our cellular activities as if it were a huge, molecular brain. A genetic lottery winner's every cell carries DNA that regulates cell growth and activity better than your average Joe's. Not because they're just dumb lucky, but because their regulatory DNA or chromosomal brain functions better. Just like your brain, to function properly, DNA needs to be able to remember what it's learned. How chromosomes learn. To understand the genetic brain, how it works, and why it might sometimes forget how to function as perfectly as we may wish, let's get a closer look at chromosomes. Each of your 46 chromosomes is actually one very long DNA molecule containing up to 300 million pairs of genetic letters, called nucleic acids. The genetic alphabet only has 4 letters, A, G, T, and C. All of our genetic data is encrypted in the patterns of these 4 letters. Change a letter and you change the pattern, and with it the meaning. Change the meaning, and you very well may change an organism's growth. Biologists had long assumed that letter substitution was the only way to generate such physiologic change. Epigenetics has taught us that, more often, the reason different individuals develop different physiology stems not from permanent letter substitutions but from temporary markers or epigenetic tags that attach themselves to the double helix and change how genes are expressed. Some of these markers are in place at birth, but throughout a person's life, many of them detach while others accumulate. Researchers needed to know what this tagging meant. Is it just a matter of DNA aging, or is something else or anything more exciting going on? If everyone developed the same tags during their lives, then it was simple aging. But if the tagging occurred differentially, then it suggests different life experiences can lead to different genetic function. It also means that, in a sense, our genes can learn. In 2005, scientists in Spain found a way to solve the mystery. They prepared chromosomes from 2 sets of identical twins, one set aged 3 and the other aged 50. Using fluorescent green and red molecules that bind, respectively, to epigenetically modified and unmodified segments of DNA, they examined the 2 sets of genes. The children's genes looked very similar, indicating that, as one would expect, twins start life with essentially identical genetic tags. In contrast, the 50-year-old chromosomes lit up green and red like 2 Christmas trees with different decorations. Their life experiences had tagged their genes in ways that meant these identical twins were, in terms of their genetic function, no longer identical. 15 This means the tagging is not just due to aging. It is a direct result of how we live our lives. Other studies since have shown that epigenetic tagging occurs in response to chemicals that form as a result of everything we eat, drink, breathe, think, and do. It seems our genes are always listening, always on the ready to respond and change. In photographing the different patterns in red and green on the 2 50-year-old chromosomes, scientists were capturing the 2 different personalities the woman's genes had developed. This differential genetic tagging would help explain why twins with identical DNA might develop completely different medical problems. If one twin smokes, drinks and eats nothing but junk food while the other takes care of her body, the 2 sets of DNA are getting entirely different chemical lessons. One is getting a balanced education when the other is getting schooled in the dirty streets of chemical chaos. In a sense, our lifestyles teach our genes how to behave. In choosing between healthy or unhealthy foods and habits, we are programming our genes for either good or bad conduct. Scientists are identifying numerous techniques by which 2 sets of identical DNA can be coerced into functioning dissimilarly. So far, the processes identified include bookmarking, imprinting, gene silencing, X chromosome inactivation, position effect, reprogramming, transvection, maternal effects, histone modification, and paramutation. Many of these epigenetic regulatory processes involve tagging sections of DNA with markers that govern how often a gene uncoils and unzips. Once exposed, a gene is receptive to enzymes that translate it into protein. If unexposed, it remains dormant and the protein it codes for doesn't get expressed. If one twin sister drinks a lot of milk and moves to Hawaii where her skin can make vitamin D in response to the sun, while the other avoids dairy and moves to Minnesota, then one will predictably develop weaker bones than the other and will likely suffer from more hip, spine, and other osteoporosis-related fractures. 16. The epigenetic twin study tells us that it's not only their X-rays that will look different, their genes will too. Scientists are becoming convinced that failure to attend to the proper care and feeding of our bodies doesn't just affect us, it affects our genes. Indeed, that means it may affect our offspring. Research shows that when one sibling has osteoporosis and the other doesn't, you'll find the genes encoding for bone growth in the osteoporotic member have gone to sleep, having been tagged, temporarily, to stay unexposed and dormant. 17. Fortunately, they'll wake up from their slumber if we change our habits. Unfortunately, the twin who smoked in our previous example may have lost too much bone to ever catch up to her milk-drinking, vitamin D fortified sister. What is worse, any epigenetic markings she developed before conceiving children can be transmitted to her offspring, or that her avoidance of bone-building nutrients has consequences for them. Her children will inherit relatively sleepy bone growth genes and be born epigenetically prone to osteoporosis. You could say that when it comes to remembering how to build bone, the epigenetic brain had grown a wee bit forgetful. Marcus Pembry, professor of clinical genetics at the Institute of Child Health in London, believes that we are all guardians of our genome. The way people live in their lifestyle no longer just affects them, but may have a knock-off effect for their children and grandchildren. 18. What fascinates me most is the intelligence of the system. It seems our genes have found ways to take notes, to remind themselves what to do with the various nutrients they are fed. Here's how. Let's say a gene for building bone is tagged with two epigenetic markers, one that binds to vitamin D and another that binds to calcium. And let's say that when vitamin D and calcium are both bound to their respective markers at the same time, the gene uncoils and can be expressed. If there is no calcium and no vitamin D, then the gene remains dormant and less bone is built. The epigenetic regulatory tags are effectively serving as a kind of post-it note. When there's lots of vitamin D and calcium around, make a bunch of the protein encoded for right here. When they do, voila, you're building bone. It's truly an elegant design. Of course, DNA doesn't know what a given gene actually does. It doesn't even know what the various nutrients it contacts are good for. Through mechanisms not fully understood, DNA has been programmed at some point in the past by epigenetic markers that can turn certain DNA portions on or off in response to certain nutrients. The entire programming system is designed for change. These markers can, apparently, fall off, causing the genetic brain to forget, at least temporarily, previously programmed information. This forgotten information can be recalled, given the right environment. This is why I believe we all have the potential to be or at least give birth to genetic lottery winners, because a forgetful genome can be retrained. You can see evidence of this retraining in laboratory animals. Dr. Randy Girdle at Duke University studied the effects of nutrient fortification on a breed of mice, called agouti, known for their yellow color and predisposition for developing severe obesity and subsequent diabetes. Starting with a female agouti raised on ordinary mouse chow, he fed her super-fortified pellets enriched with vitamin B12, folic acid, choline, and betaine and mated her to another agouti male. Instead of the usual overweight, unhealthy yellow-coat babies she'd normally give birth to, she instead bore brown mice that developed normally. 19. You could interpret this study as follows. The agouti breed has regulatory DNA that's essentially been brain damaged by some past traumas in the history of the lineage. As a result, agouti chromosomes, unlike other mice, are typically incapable of building healthy, normal offspring. In this study, researchers were able to rehabilitate the agouti's genome by blasting the sleepy genes with enough nutrients to wake them up, reprogramming their genes for better function. This has enormous implications for us, as researchers are finding abnormal regulatory scars all over our genes, records of our ancestors' experiences then with the weather. Toward the end of WWII, an unusually harsh winter combined with a German-imposed food embargo led to death by starvation of some 30,000 people. Those who survived suffered from a range of developmental and adult disorders, including low birth weight, diabetes, obesity, coronary heart disease, breast and other cancers. A group of Dutch researchers has associated this exposure with the birth of smaller than normal grandchildren. 20 This finding is remarkable as it suggests the effects of a pregnant woman's diet can ripple, at the least, into the next 2 generations. Unlike the agouti mice, which required massive doses of vitamins, these people would possibly respond well to normal or only slightly above normal levels of nutrients as their genes have been affected only for a short while, last a generation or 2. Unlike the mice eating, it might not take quite so much extra nutrition to wake them up. Some epigenetic reactions are not merely passed on but magnified. In a study of the effects of maternal smoking on a child's risk of developing asthma, doctors at the Keck School of Medicine in Los Angeles discovered that children whose mothers smoked while pregnant were 1.5 times more likely to develop asthma than those born to non-smoking mothers. If grandma smoked, the child was 1.8 times more likely to develop asthma than if mom never touched a cigarette. Those children whose mother and grandmother both smoked while pregnant had their risk elevated by 2.6. Figure 1. The nucleus, where food programs genes. Here we see one loop of the DNA double helix wrapped around nuclear regulatory proteins, shown as smaller coils. The tightness or looseness of the association helps determine how often a given gene gets expressed. When tightly coiled, genes are isolated from enzymes that transcribe their information, and protein production is turned off. When a tightly coiled gene segment loosens enough for enzymes to bind to it, the gene is now effectively turned on again. But epigenetics is showing that these binary designations of off and on aren't the whole story, and that we have all kinds of in-between settings. This means that the chromosomal data is stored and expressed in analog terms rather than digital, enabling our DNA to compute more information than we imagined. Times 21. Why would DNA react this way? If you look for the logic in this decision, you might see it like this: by smoking during pregnancy, you are telling the embryo that the air is full of toxins and that breathing is sometimes dangerous. The developing lungs would do well to be able to react quickly to any inhaled irritants. Asthmatic lungs are overreactive. They cough and spit at the slightest whiff of foreign aerosols. Still, I believe even a genome is abused, as this can be reminded of normal function. Why do I have so much faith in the restorative power of good epigenetic care? Because contrary to the old ways of thinking, we now know it is rarely anything as permanent as a mutation that causes most disease. As we've seen, environmentally derived chemicals mark the long molecule with tags that change its behavior. Such a system, according to Randy Jertle, seems to be to provide a rapid mechanism by which an organism can respond to the environment without having to change its hardware. 22 This way, any physiologic tweak or modification can be recalled based on its apparent success or failure. Call it test marketing for a proposed mutation. That may seem a rather sophisticated operation for a molecule to pull off, but remember, we're talking about a molecule that has been in development ever since life on Earth began. With this new understanding of how DNA works, we can now appreciate how easily nutrient deficiencies or exposure to toxins might lead to chronic disease, and how readily these diseases might respond to eliminating toxins and improving nutrition. At Yale's Center for Excellence in Genomic Science, Dr. Dov S. Greenbaum shares my faith in the intellect behind the design of our genetic apparatus. In describing how junk DNA functions to guide evolution, he writes, "The movement of transposable junk results in a dynamic system of gene activation, which allows for the organism to adapt to its environment." 23 He describes the function very much like Jertle, adding that this transposition system allows for the organism to adapt to its environment without redesigning its hardware. 24 To further the analogy, it's conceivable that genetic modifications are introduced under a protocol similar to that used by software designers, test for bugs, then run concurrent with other software on a provisional basis. The beta version of the program, then integrate into the operating system, and finally and prove to be indispensable it into the hardware. This might have been exactly what happened with the human gene for making vitamin C. After generations of non-use due to abundance of vitamin C in our food, the gene would have grown very sleepy. Eventually, when epigenetic test marketing had demonstrated that we could live without being able to make our own vitamin C, a mutation within the gene permanently deactivated it. How, exactly, might this test marketing work? certain markers increase the error rate during reproduction, and thus a temporary epigenetic change can set up the gene to be permanently altered by a base pair mutation. 25 genes are like tiny protein-producing machines that create different products. If a factory worker epigenetic tagging shuts off one machine and everything in the cell continues to run smoothly over the ensuing generations, then that particular machine gene can be refashioned to produce something else, or turned off altogether. The more we learn about epigenetics, the more it seems that genetic change of the development of disease and even evolution itself is as tightly controlled and subject to feedback as every other biologic process from cell development to breathing to reproduction, and, therefore, isn't so random after all. What helps regulate all these cellular events? Food, mostly. After all, food is the primary way we interact with our environment. But here's what's really remarkable. Those tags that get placed on the genes to control how they work and help drive the course of evolution are made out of simple nutrients, like minerals, vitamins, and fatty acids, or are influenced by the presence of these nutrients. In other words, there's essentially no middleman between the food you eat and what your genes are being told to do, enacting changes that can ultimately become permanent and inheritable. If food can alter genetic information in the space of a single generation, then this powerful and immediate relationship between diet and DNA should place nutritional shifts at the front of the stage in the continuing drama of human evolution. Evidence for language and DNA. We have no clear idea how nature keeps track of which programming codes work best for what, or how the many environmental inputs, minerals, vitamins, toxins, and so on might be translated into a new epigenetic strategy, but recent research offers intriguing support to the idea that DNA can indeed take notes. In 1994, mathematicians observed that junk contained patterns reminiscent of natural language, since it follows, among other things, Zipf's law, a hierarchical word distribution pattern found in all natural languages. 26, 27, 28, 29. Some geneticists disagree with this assessment, while others think this added layer of complexity might eventually help explain many of DNA's hidden mysteries. But everyone agrees there's plenty of space in junk DNA for all kinds of data storage. Junk DNA is a large enough repository of information to function as a kind of chemical software program to, for want of a better term, recognize something about the dietary conditions provided it and then include this updated information when it reproduces itself. Some molecular biologists feel that this capability to orchestrate a measured response to environmental change demands that we consider the language encoded in junk DNA as an independent mechanism for the gradual regulation of gene expression in higher organisms. 30. Independent meaning something other than the previously accepted mechanisms of selection and random mutation. One example of the logic underlying DNA's behavior can be found by observing the effects of vitamin A deficiency. In the late 1930s, Professor Fred Hale of the Texas Agricultural Experiment Station at College Station was able to deprive pigs of vitamin A before conception so that the mother would produce a litter without any eyeballs. 31. When the mother was refed vitamin A, her next litter of babies developed normal eyeballs, suggesting that eyeball growth was not switched off due to permanent mutation, but to a temporary epigenetic modification. Vitamin A is derived from retinoids, which come from plants, which in turn depend on sunlight. So in responding to the absence of vitamin A by turning off the genes to grow eyes, it is as if DNA interpreted the lack of vitamin A as a lack of light, or a lightless environment in which eyes would be of no use. The eyeless pigs had lids, very much like blind cave salamanders. It's possible that these and other blind cave dwellers have undergone a similar epigenetic modification of the genes controlling eye growth in response to low levels of vitamin A in a lightless, plantless cave environment. Taken together, epigenetic evidence paints DNA as a far more dynamic and intelligent mechanism of adaptation than has been generally appreciated. In effect, DNA seems capable of collecting information raw, the language of food, about changing conditions in the outside world, enacting alteration based on that information, and documenting both the collected data and its response for the benefit of subsequent generations. Junk DNA is full of genetic treasure. It may function as a kind of ever-expanding library, complete with its own insightful library and capable of researching previously written volumes of successful and unsuccessful genetic adaptation strategies. It follows that more complex organisms, with larger cells whose genomes represent a more complex evolutionary history, will carry relatively more substantial libraries filled with more junk DNA. And we do 32. The intelligent library stands in direct opposition to the placement of selection and random mutation as the sole mechanisms of genetic change in the development of new species. Given the highly competitive world of survival, it seems obvious that those genetic codes capable of listening to the outside world and using that information to guide decisions would enjoy a marked advantage compared with those stumbling in the dark, dependent completely on luck. This understanding may give rise to an entirely new perspective on how we came to be, placing a new spin on intelligent design. DNA's ability to respond intelligently to changes in its nutritional environment enables it to take advantage of the shifting cornucopia, exploiting rich nutritional contexts like the way an interior decorator would make use of a surprise shipment of high-quality silk upholstery. Our genes may help us survive periods of famine and stress by way of experiment, and take advantage of any nutritional glut to experiment further on blindly, not with random mutations, but with memory and purpose, guided by past experiences encoded within its own structure. How does this matter to you? The chemical intelligence encoded in your DNA and the intelligence of our distant ancestors share the same ultimate goal: survive. Inside your ancestors' bodies, their genomes shuffled themselves to match nutrient supply with physiologic demands, while the people who carried them shared tool-making tips and rumors of food sources which, repelled by the synergy of purpose, would catapult a small group of primates from a nook of the African continent to a state of world domination. Under the watchful eye of grandmothers and midwives, special foods and preparations proved themselves effective at creating children who could learn faster and grow stronger than the generation before. Children who, naturally, would grow to become parents themselves, able to form their own sets of observations and conclusions about the way the world works and how best to guarantee survival. One of the things that makes human beings and their ancestors unique is the sophistication of tool use that enabled consumption of a greater proportion of the edible world than the competition, furthering the agenda of our perpetually reincarnating, self-revising, constantly upgrading, ruthlessly selfish genes. We have managed to shepherd our own genomes through millennia, roaming from one ocean to another, over mountains and across whole continents, and into the modern age. Those hoping to maintain the product of that achievement, beautiful, healthy human body, want to acquaint themselves with the foods and preparation techniques that allowed us to get this far in the first place. By eating the foods described later in this book, you will be talking directly to your genes. Your foods will tell your epigenome to make your body stronger, more energized, healthier, and more beautiful. And your epigenome will listen, unblocking your genetic potential. Whether you believe in the idea of genetic intelligence or not, the one thing I hope I've made clear in this chapter is that our genes are not written in stone. They are exquisitely sensitive to how we treat them. Like a fine painting passed down through generations, conditions that either harm or preserve are permanently recorded in the provenance of a family's DNA. When the DNA is mistreated, like a Monet thrown into the corner of a damp, musty basement, the inheritance loses its value. And the losses may be devastating. Between Halle Berry and the person who cleans her bathrooms, and between all the tall, trim, and beautiful people strutting the red carpets in Hollywood or the tennis courts in the Hamptons, and the rest of us who can only watch our untold stories of nutritional starvation, of lost or distorted genetic information. This variability in our ancestors' ability to safeguard their genetic wealth is the reason why, today, we have so many people wishing for better health, better looks, greater athleticism, and all the manifold benefits of healthy genes. In Chapter 1, I introduced the idea that the genetic lottery is not random, and in this chapter we saw how genes make what seem to be intelligent decisions guided in part by chemical information in the food we eat. In the next chapter, we'll see that when we've eaten right, our chromosomes have marinated long enough in the chemical soup that enables them to do their utmost best. Homo sapiens genes can produce extraordinary beauty. In fact, no matter what race you are talking about, our genetic minds seem to dream of the same ideal. This is why beautiful people of every race share the same basic skeletal geometry, and why for the bulk of human history, Hollywood beauties were as plentiful as the stars. 3. Dynamic symmetry. Nature's desire for beauty. Few people can make sense when they talk about beauty. The subject is either too profound or too emotionally charged to describe objectively. Even talent agents who make their living in the beauty trade characterize it using imprecise euphemisms: a glow, it's certain something. Press a publisher, judge, or news reporter hard enough and you might get them to confess, privately, that good looks matter more to them than they'd rather admit. On the other hand, feminists, including author Camille Paglia, have suggested that beauty may all be a big put-on, and that without cover girls, movie stars, and other models saturating the media, we'd be immune to its effects. Controversial and enigmatic as the subject of beauty may seem, in reality, beauty is simply another natural phenomenon which, like gravity or the speed of light, can be quantified, analyzed, and understood. Though poets and songwriters might object, significant benefits can be derived from deconstructing human beauty using the same tools we would bring to any other scientific question. For starters, beauty can tell us quite a lot about our genetic histories, our bodies, and our health. Ancient people, by comparison, may have been far more rational in their consideration of beauty. Their emblems, art, and artifacts of worship consistently feature geometric forms, and many today believe the Inca, Maya, Athenians, Romans, Druids, and ancient Egyptians recognized that beauty and health were related. Even today, outside of the field of medicine, many life science professionals apply their ability to judge physical attractiveness without hesitation. When a farmer or a racehorse breeder or rare orchid grower sees obvious disruptions in healthy growth, they naturally consider the nutritional context in which the specimen was raised. If a prize-winning mare gives birth to a foal with abnormally bound legs, the veterinarian recognizes that something went wrong and, often, asks the logical question, what was the mother eating? But physicians rarely do that, even when life-threatening problems show up right at birth. And we continue to neglect the nutrition development equation when our patients develop scoliosis, joint malformations, aneurysms, autism, schizophrenia, and so on later in life. If doctors and nutritionists were as willing to use their basic senses as other professionals, every child would have a better chance to grow up healthy. The way we look speaks volumes about our health because of the fact that form implies function, and this means our desire for beauty is no simple matter of vanity. Less attractive facial forms are less functional. Children with suboptimal skull architecture may need glasses, braces, or oral surgery, whereas children with more ideal architecture won't. 33 Such a child may have narrow airways, leading to nasal irritation and allergies. 34, 35 or even sleep apnea, which starves the brain of oxygen needed to develop normal intelligence. 36, 37 One of the few instances in which doctors do use visual assessments to screen for health disorders is with a condition known loosely as minor anomalies, also known, much less formally, as the funny-looking kid. It's common enough that it even has an acronym, FLK. This diagnosis is one of the primary reasons for genetic testing. Children with growth anomalies are the group most often found to have genetic disease and internal organ malformations, and they frequently develop learning disorders, socialization disorders, and cancer. 38 And let's not pretend the person's physical development has no social consequences. Less attractive people rate themselves as less popular, 39 less happy, 40 and less healthy, 41 they are more depressed more often, 42 spend more time in jail, 43 and are less well paid as adults, 44 than their more attractive peers. All preconceptions aside, the evidence suggests that the same conditions that allow our DNA to create health also allow our DNA to grow beautiful people. I call this phenomenon the package deal effect because beauty and health are just that package deal. The more you have of one, the more you probably have of the other. You may, on some level, have already suspected this. In high school you may have noticed, as Rod Stewart sang in the 1980s, some guys have all the luck. Case in point, your homecoming king. No doubt he was popular, but was he also athletic? And did he get pretty good grades? What about your prom queen? Was she attractive? Smart? The epitome of good health? And was your valedictorian also attractive? I'm going to guess that, just as with my high school, the answers are all yes. But why should this be so? What is it about beauty that makes something not only look better, but function better? And why do we want it so badly? Like the laws of engineering, chemistry, and physics, the laws of physical attraction emerge from the fabric of the universe and can best be understood using the language of mathematics. The man who discovered the perfect face. The desire for beauty is so great that some of us take matters into our own hands, or rather, into the hands of a professional, or get a larger helping of its sweet rewards. In 2005, more than 11 million cosmetic procedures were performed by more than 5,000 plastic surgeons in the U.S. alone. Most procedures involve moving fat, skin, and muscle around the face and body, but an extreme makeover can require breaking and resetting bone. As these doctors permanently rearrange our looks, what standards, do you suppose, guide their decisions? The answer is none, none aside from their own personal aesthetics and experience. Thankfully, their skills usually leave the patient looking better rather than worse. But their training does not provide them with instructions for rebuilding faces according to any universal standard of ideal facial architecture. Why not? Simply put, it's complicated. Each person's face has a distinct 3D geometry that our brains can interpret. We don't know how exactly, and most of us don't need to worry about it. But if plastic surgeons want to build better faces reliably, and if they want to know whether or not they will be repositioning a jaw, a tooth, or an eyebrow in a functional, attractive location, they must find a way to describe functional, attractive facial geometry. Such was the thinking of a bright, young maxillofacial surgeon at UCLA named Dr. Stephen Marquardt. One evening in the late 1970s, Dr. Marquardt couldn't sleep. In 2 days' time he would commence an operation on a woman who'd been in a terrible car accident. It was his job to reconstruct her badly damaged lower face. But one question nagged him all night: how can I be sure she'll be happy with the results? In those days there were relatively few plastic surgeons, even in LA, and patients would receive their particular surgeon's trademark work. Audrey Hepburn's nose with results so consistent that other surgeons could tell who the patient had seen. Dr. Marquardt realized Hepburn's petite nose, as undeniably cute as it is, might not be the right nose for just anyone. How could a doctor know which nose, or chin, or jawline is best proportioned for the face of the person on the operating table? Marquardt wondered why there weren't some rules or standards to follow. Would he always have to guess, fingers crossed, or might there be a more dependable approach? In a search for answers, Dr. Marquardt went to a museum and spent the day examining great works of art. At the end of the day he had a stack of sketches, but no definitive set of rules. He wanted to know what, if any, principle guided the creation of all great works of art. Over the next several months he studied rules of beauty in architecture, art, music, and more. Still, no consistent theme had yet emerged. Finally, he recognized that he kept running across formulas, like the triangle on the color wheel, and the rule of threes in photography. He'd been studying individual subjects to find a common link, and that link was mathematics. At the core of the mathematical principles of beauty lay a set of numbers named after the Italian who first discovered it in the 11th century: the Fibonacci Sequence. Beauty's secret code. You may remember the Fibonacci sequence from the Da Vinci Code, in which the cryptologist heroine discovers a series of numbers her grandfather wrote on the floor with invisible ink at the site of his murder: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The sequence builds by summing the last two numbers on the end, growing forever. Had the dead man lived to write the next number, he would have written 34. He sum of 13 and 21. If one were looking for a universal code of proportionate growth, the sequence of numbers would be the holy grail. As you extend the sequence out to infinity, the ratio of the last two terms converges on any rational number, approximately 1.618033988. This is the golden ratio, used by the Greeks and Egyptians to design perfectly balanced works of structural art that mystify architects even today. The golden ratio is symbolized by the Greek letter phi, pronounced phi, rhymes with pi. In his pursuit of the perfect face, Dr. Mark Wyatt discovered that the golden ratio is uniquely capable of generating a special kind of symmetry, called dynamic symmetry. According to the theory of perception, there are two ways to create harmonic balance within an object or space. One is to divide it into equal parts, creating the symmetry of balance. The other is a division based on the golden section, creating the perfect form of asymmetry perfect because the ratio of the lesser part to the greater part is the same as the ratio of the greater part to the whole. See Figure 3. This is dynamic symmetry. Interestingly, dynamic symmetry characterizes the growth of living matter, while static symmetry characterizes the growth of crystals. The literature on human beauty is full of references to biradial symmetry, suggesting that, if one side perfectly mirrors the other, you've got a beautiful face. But that's a misconception, and here's why. Although dynamic symmetry often leads to biradial symmetry does not guarantee, or even imply, dynamic symmetry. Put another way, biradial symmetry is a necessary, though not sufficient, characteristic of an attractive human face. Living, growing beings are dynamic, and that's exactly the kind of symmetry that makes them beautiful. The Egyptians and Greeks worshipped Phi as a fountainhead of eternal beauty, calling it the divine ratio. The Parthenon and other great works of ancient architecture that still stand today do so in part because they were designed around this mathematic principle of ideal proportion, and architects to this day still study them with wonder. The philosopher Socrates saw geometry, in which phi plays a central role in relating various forms, not only as a guiding constant of the natural world but also as a potential source of life itself. Da Vinci was obsessed with geometric relationships in the structure of the human form. His famous Vitruvian Man sketch of a man superimposed on a circle in a square illustrates his own quest for a code of nature that generates living forms. Like generations of scientists before him, Dr. Mark Wyatt focused on phi as the essential clue. The divine ratio had to be buried somewhere in the proportions of the perfect human face. If Hollywood were to set the action to film, they would show a montage of Dr. Mark Wyatt at his desk holding his compass and protractor to a series of cover girls' faces, then a heap of dulled pencils in the foreground as he scratches out another formula involving square roots and algebraic variables. Until finally the moment of epiphany. Cut to Mark Wyatt raising his cipher to the camera, a clear sheet of acetate on which his primary golden decagon matrix is printed in bold, black lines, the angulated mask of a perfect human face. Mark Wyatt's mask is a matrix of points, lines, and angles delineating the geometric framework and borders of what Mark Wyatt calls the archetypal face, a plotted graph of the visual ideal our collective unconscious yearns for. Nested within the matrix are 42 secondary golden decagon matrices, each the same shape as the larger matrix, but smaller by various multiples of phi. These lock onto the primary matrix by at least two vertices. 45 The mask defines the ideal three-dimensional arrangement of every facial feature, from the size of the eyes and their distance from one another to the width of the nose, to the fullness of the upper and lower lip, and so on. In John Cleese's BBC series The Human Face, featuring Mark Wyatt and based largely on his research, the mask transparency is placed atop separate photos of Marilyn Monroe, Halle Berry, and Elizabeth Taylor. Like a glass slipper sliding over Cinderella's foot, the mask fit each face perfectly, revealing the fact that, though each woman could be distinguished through skin tone and hair color, these icons of megastardom are all kin of consummate proportion who, by no coincidence, entered the world wearing the same archetypical mask. So much for beauty being in the eye of the beholder. Beautiful people exist not because of luck, but because all DNA is naturally driven to create dynamically symmetric geometry as it's generating tissue growth. Mark Wyatt's work reveals the specific geometry that human DNA creates. Like the Egyptian scientists thousands of years ago who found mathematical order extended throughout their landscape and out into the stars, I believe the same mathematic principles that give order to the universe also govern the growth of every part of every living thing. When that growth proceeds optimally, beautiful and functional biologic structures are the inevitable result. This is not a new idea. it echoes the writings of ancient philosophers from Plato to Pythagoras. What we can now understand that could not have been known in ancient times, however, is precisely how our brains recognize this math. Why we like beautiful things, nature's geometric logic. Take a walk through a garden, in the woods, or on a beach, and you'll see all kinds of pretty things. If you look a bit closer, you'll notice patterns, curves, whorls, spirals, even repeating numbers. What's behind this? A new discipline, called biomathematics, is all about answering that question. Biomathematicians are confirming that phi and the Fibonacci sequence are encoded not just in the human face, but in living matter everywhere. The shape of a pinocchio, the segments of insect bodies, the spiral of the nautilus shell, the bones of your fingers, and the relative sizes of your teeth, everything that grows owes its form to the geometry of phi. When a plant shoot puts out a new leaf, it does so in such a way that lower leaves are least obscured, and can still receive sunlight. This is a benefit of a phenomenon called Philataxis, which describes the spiraling growth of stems, petals, roots, and other plant organs in 90% of plants throughout the world. 46 The angle of Philataxis is 137.5 degrees, or 1/phi2x 360 degrees. We can see the same pattern of branching, twisting, so-called dendritic growth when we look at nerve cells in the brain. All these instances of pattern growth are directed not by DNA but by the rules of math and physics, which act on living tissue automatically to create pattern. After the flow of genetic information has dropped off, like a lunar module floating through space, the organism's growth is now on autopilot. As author, journalist, and TV producer Dr. Simon Singh explains, physics and mathematics are capable of producing intricate patterns in non-organic constructions, for example, snowflakes and sand dunes. They can offer a range of patterns which will emerge spontaneously, given the correct starting conditions. The theory which is currently gaining support says that life operates by using DNA to create the right starting conditions, and thereafter physics and maths do all the rest. 47. Biomathematics offers us a fundamentally new perspective of the universe and the living world. It is allowing us to recognize that recurring patterns seen throughout our living landscape are more than just coincidences. They seem to reflect the elemental structure and order of the universe itself. 48, 49. This organizing force, which helps sculpt a beautiful face, also functions during development of the organ with which you recognize beauty, your brain. Within the jelly-like matrix inside our skulls, neurons in the human brain form bifurcating tendrils, called dendrites, meaning branches. We call them dendrites because the earliest scientists who peered at neurons under a microscope were reminded of stately, graceful trees. For us to think and learn, these trees must be properly proportioned. This enchanted forest is the hidden landscape where beautiful minds are born. Why would phylactic patterns of growth form inside the dark vaults of our skulls? The most obvious answer is, because every healthy part of every living thing follows the same basic formula for growth in order to function. Just as a golden angle delineates phylactic growth and helps plants capture more sunlight, the same dynamic symmetry may allow our brains to pack in as many nerve connections per cubic inch as possible, making best use of the limited real estate between our ears. More complex than any computer and more efficient, the network in your brain works because each brain cell is connected to thousands of others. Those connections enable you to recognize faces, flowers, food and other familiar objects. How? With pattern. Cognition is what mathematicians would call an emergent property. Emergence refers to the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. Your thoughts and emotions are, likewise, not based on any individual brain cell's contents, but on the resonance frequencies that arise when millions of interconnected neurons are stimulated. 51 Phi may help our brains work better using its nimble mathematic flexibility to allow resonance to occur more often. When our nerves are structured so as to contain the maximum internal symmetry, not only can we sustain more complex perceptions, we can better comprehend the relationships between perceptions, memories, thoughts, and other cognitive phenomena. In other words, every specialized subportion of our entire brains can function as an interconnected unit, and poof! Consciousness emerges. The pleasure we derive from looking at attractive people may offer us more insight into how the brain works. If beautiful faces share the same fundamental proportionality as the connections in our brain's high hand, they may trigger a more ordered series of recognizable resonances than faces with less symmetry, which may enable us to recognize the image as a distinctly human face that much faster. The biology of our brains may be such that our figure 8b, why attractive people entrance us brains experience pleasure on having solved the puzzle of sorting out just what it is we're looking at. Every time the brain is presented with an image or sound, it is, in essence, being posed a kind of mathematic riddle. The more pleasing the image or harmonious the sound, the fewer the barriers standing between the beholder and the pleasure of the epiphany of a solution. The Fibonacci sequence may facilitate this process, enabling us to solve these visual or acoustic riddles faster by serving as a template that helps order our minds and orchestrate our thoughts. Not only, then, does Phi offer us beauty, it also seems to arrange our nerves in ways that facilitate intelligence. Instinctive attraction, the myth of the eye of the beholder. The fact that the architecture of our neural tissue so closely mirrors that of dynamically symmetric, and therefore attractive, objects in the outer world helps to explain how our brains work. It also explains why our brains would prefer images of this same symmetry over others. Their familiar geometry resonates instantaneously with our own, making beautiful objects easier to perceive. Suggesting that beauty recognition seems hardwired into our brains, Nancy Eckhoff, author of Survival of the Prettiest, tells us that, when babies fix their stare at the same face as adults describe as highly attractive, their actions wordlessly argue against the belief that culture must teach us to recognize human beauty. Consider the complications that would arise if a cheetah sizing up a herd had to be trained to recognize the absence of health, to meticulously weigh the implications of a halting gait or an uneven coat, signs of injury and disease. Without a killer instinct, or an instinctive guide to health, predators would go hungry, social animals would put themselves in contact with disease, and good genes would be diluted with compromised DNA. This idea that we humans instinctively recognize the form-function relationship and use physical appearance, and specifically dynamic symmetry, to gauge health is supported by studies in which people were shown a series of male and female faces, each with varying levels of symmetry, and asked to make judgments about who was healthiest. What emerged was an undeniable positive correlation between the possession of dynamic symmetry and the perception of health. 52 So whether we're a cheetah, a baby, or a doctor, as far as our brains are concerned, dynamic symmetry and the attractiveness equals health. Of course, the ultimate purpose of this subconscious appreciation of the form-function relationship is the perpetuation of our DNA through the act of reproduction. And when it comes to the mating game, our responses to attractive members of the appropriate sex will typically percolate from their origins deep in our psyche to reach the surface, where they can become all-consuming. The perfect mate, in search of sexual dimorphism. When looking for that perfect man or woman, research shows that facial features deviating from Mark Wyatt's geometric blueprint even slightly make a surprisingly large impression. Our lack of impression. 53 A set of lips that fall just a millimeter or two short of luscious fullness, or eyes just a fraction of an inch too close together, downgrade a girl from pretty to plain. Take a strong brow and chin and pull them both back a tiny bit, and you change a handsome, dominating mankind you might envision as CEO of a company, or captain of the ship in an adventure movie, into a docile-looking office drone. Every curve of our features is sculpted under the influence of nature's tendency toward perfection. Our minds, too, are tuned by the ratio of phi, and so we desire dynamic symmetry, and pursue it with great tenacity. The extreme attraction we have towards sex objects exists because, during puberty, our gray matter is tuned to lust after a well-defined set of sex-specific variations on Mark Wyatt's mask figure 10. These variations on the theme of human attractiveness are collectively called sexual dimorphism. While sex differences in our facial and skeletal development exist in childhood, they become much more pronounced at sexual maturity. The package deal effect predicts that those bodies which develop the full gamut of sex-specific features are the healthiest, and research correlating female body type with health bears this out. Female body type and health. beauty researchers have divided female body types into 4 categories. In order of declining frequency they are banana, apple, pear, and hourglass. Several studies performed in 2005 showed that apple-shaped women with short waists and narrow hips had almost double the chance of dying during the study compared to women with more generous curves 54, 55. Why would that be? Voluptuousness is an indication of healthy female sexual dimorphism, while a lack of voluptuousness indicates a problem. Normally, the hips and bust develop during puberty as a result of a healthy surge in sex hormones. These developments involve expansion of the pelvic bones along with the deposition of fat and glandular tissue within the breasts. But women whose genetics are such that their spines are abnormally short or their hormonal surge less pronounced or whose diet is such that it interferes with the body's response to hormones end up with boxier figures. If they're thin, they'll end up as bananas. If they put on weight, it gets distributed in a more masculine pattern in the belly, on the neck, and around the upper arms, and they'll become an apple. Today, after 3 generations of trans fat consumption which interferes with hormone expression, see Chapter 8, and with daily infusions of sugar which interferes with hormone receptivity, see Chapter 9, hourglass figures have become something of a rarity. According to a 2005 study commissioned by Alva Products, a manufacturer of designers' mannequins, less than 10% of women today develop the voluptuous curves we're supposed to 56. In a world of apples, pears, and bananas, writer Nancy Etkoff has suggested that the most beautiful among us are genetic freaks. It's not an insult, she is merely referencing the statistical improbability of someone growing up to look like, to use her example, Cindy Crawford. But the suggestion seems to capture Etkoff's general thesis accurately. When a stunningly beautiful person is born, it's largely the result of genetic chance. These select few, the thinking goes, played the genetic lottery and won big. But I couldn't disagree more. Why would biology program us to be hot for genetic freaks? It seems to me far more probable that we are attracted to beautiful bodies because they advertise health. In keeping with this idea, researchers studying the effect of these 4 female body types on lifespan find that women with the most attractive of the 4 body types, the hourglass, live the longest. Women with the least attractive figure, the blocky, often overweight apples, have the shortest lifespans, frequently dying from complications of diabetes 57. Why aren't all bodies perfect? So far I've shown you a good deal of evidence that beauty is not incidental, not an accident of fate. It is the default position, the inevitable product of natural, unimpeded growth whose progress conforms to rules of mathematic proportion. Just as the laws of physics dictate that 6-sided crystals inevitably result when clouds of water vapor form in freezing air, generations of optimal nutrition prime human chromosomal material for optimal growth. If optimal nutrition continues throughout childhood development, the laws of biology dictate the final result, a beautiful, healthy person. But if beauty emerges naturally from well-ordered growth, then why aren't all of us beautiful? In October 2006, at a meeting in his Huntington Beach home, I asked Dr. Mark Wyatt his opinion. His answer was, "We are." When I said I was surprised to hear this from a person who makes his living correcting facial anomalies, he elaborated, "If you put the mask over the population, you'll see that many people are not that far off from a perfect fit, though we wouldn't regard them as highly attractive. The variability we do have," he believes, stems from the fact that we've evolved past the point of efficiency. In other words, societal safety nets allow people who are perfectly healthy or functional to reproduce, whereas, in the past, they would simply have died off. Mark Wyatt's pragmatic explanation sheds some light on the origins of our current, historically unprecedented level of attractiveness variability. If we examine human history and focus only on access to nutrients, we would find that with civilization and sedentism not migrating came food shortages and disease. But sedentism was also less physically demanding than the wandering, hunter or hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and so it acted as a kind of safety net. Living in settled, relatively crowded cities began to chip away at our genetic programming, leading to the rise of disease while simultaneously enabling people with damaged genes, who might otherwise have died, to survive and give birth to less healthy children with less dynamic symmetry. Bit by bit, the genetic wealth created by thousands of years of successful survival in the wild was squandered as poverty or plague denied genes the nutrients they needed. During each period of nutritional deprivation, valuable epigenetic programming was lost. As time has passed, we have required more and more safety nets and invented correctives like glasses, braces, and thousands of medications. Some would argue this physiologic fall from grace has not yet proved to be maladaptive for people living in modern industrialized societies, as we are still successfully reproducing. But that might be changing. Like many doctors in this country, I'm seeing more young couples frustrated by infertility. How widespread this problem will become remains to be seen. I'm certainly not suggesting that only supermodels should have babies. And since I have argued that the genes of all people of every race and every walk of life carry the potential of extraordinary beauty and health, the implications of this chapter run about as far from the specter of eugenics as you can get. What I am saying is that not the same way that I tell women trying to get pregnant to stop smoking and drinking, take their folic acid, and avoid medications known to cause birth defects, here are nutritional choices you can make to help ensure that your baby be born healthy and beautiful if that is what you desire. Of course, parents can choose to smoke and drink and ignore their doctor's advice. But I think every one of us deserves the best, latest, most complete information with which to make choices. So if eating right can practically guarantee perfect, beautiful, growth, then what are the nutritional prerequisites for healthy growth? Believe it or not, this question had already been asked and answered in the early part of the 20th century by a man who didn't know about phi or epigenetics, but nevertheless found all the information he needed by studying people's teeth. 4. The greatest gift. The creation and preservation of genetic wealth. Egyptologist Mark Lenner walks across what appears to be the smooth surface of a backyard patio until we see that it's actually a giant precision-cut stone in the middle of an abandoned desert quarry. At 137 feet long, it would have been the largest obelisk ever made had it not cracked before being raised from its stone cradle. The obelisk had lain ignored for nearly 4,000 years, until archaeologists considered just how difficult making it and then moving it will be. Over the past few decades, similarly impressive artifacts around the world have evinced ancient civilizations in possession of technologic abilities far exceeding our own. Piecing such history back together again will be challenging because, as an article in Ancient American theorizing on whether the Incas had found a way to sculpt solid rock using concentrated sunlight explains, their best technology was highly prized. These stonemasons weren't giving away any secrets, or writing them down. Judging by the Freemasons, architects and builders who, some say, trace their lineage back to mystery schools of ancient Egypt, they were a secretive lot. 58. There is, however, another kind of ancient technology that has had far greater impact on all our lives. Very much like the jealously guarded trade secrets of ancient stonemasons and civil engineers, the most powerful nutritional secrets, too, were kept close to the chest. Nutrition as a tool for optimizing human form and function, and for protecting the integrity of family lineage, was every bit as evolved, refined, and perfected as the tools of mathematics and engineering. The remnants of these great achievements are not waiting to be unearthed. They are walking among us, visible on TV and movie screens, and printed on the covers of Vogue, Cosmo, and People magazine. If there were as many scientists researching the rituals performed in ancient kitchens as there are researching examples of ancient civil engineering, it would be common knowledge how to use nutrition to create our own great works, sculpted in bone and flesh. And if women wrote more of our history books, schoolchildren might learn something with more practical application than lists of battles won by various kings. They might learn something along the lines of what a dentist named Weston Price discovered when he traveled the world nearly a century ago, in search of the lost secrets to health. Body by ecosystem. In the early 20th century, Westerners were tantalized by the possibility that superhuman races lived just beyond the boundaries of the map. One of the most talked about groups of people were the Hunza, a Sumeri-Mes nomadic band of goat and yak herders living in the mountains of what are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. British explorers to these parts claimed to have encountered a rarefied land where cancer did not exist, where nobody needed glasses, and where it was commonplace to live beyond 100. If these accounts were true, then such people would present Western medicine with a mystery. What was their secret? Pure air? Mineral-rich glacial water? Caloric restriction? True or not, enterprising businessmen soon discovered the word Himalayan was bona fide magic tea, at least when it was printed on the tonic water bottles they were selling. Amid this circus of conjecture, capitalism, and hucksterism, one extraordinary dentist from Cleveland, Ohio was determined to inject some much-needed science. This man of introspection and quiet charm invested his own money in an amazing series of journeys, attempting to either verify or impeach these rumors. If people possessing extraordinary fitness were found, he planned to systematically analyze what made them so different